Good evening, everyone. Uh, my name is Petr Bajkowski, and I welcome you to today's lecture, Opportunities for Change by Professor Philip Nichols. The lecture is organized by Department of Political Science at Ukrainian Catholic University and America House in Ukraine. Professor Nichols is Joseph Kolodny Professor of Social Responsibility and in Business and Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at Wharton School in University of Pennsylvania. He has worked in organization in a lot of countries on issues of economical and social development. So here his research interests are corruption, emerging economies, international trade, and investment. Professor Nichols has visited Ukraine and the Ukrainian Catholic University with lectures and seminars twice. The last time it was a month ago. Professor, thank you, Professor Nichols, for your support and of our country and for your willingness and share your knowledge and experience. It's important for us because after our victory, we will definitely need it for rebuilding our country. So before I give the floor to our speaker, I want you know that after the lecture, we will have Q&A sessions. So please write your questions. And also disclaimer, the participants' position in today's meeting does not necessarily reflect the position of IREX and the United States government. So please, Professor Nichols, thank you for being here, and floor is yours.
Thank you, Petro, and thank you to the university, the Ukrainian Catholic University, and to America House. I had the opportunity to visit America House about a month ago, maybe a little over a month ago, and was very impressed with both the facility and the concept. Just fabulous place. And of course, the Catholic, boy, I always mess that up. Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv is just a generous host. The two times I've visited have been most wonderful. So if we could put the presentation up, I will begin. Yes, that's me a couple of months ago or a month ago at UCU, enjoying the fabulous weather, the unusually warm weather, and also being inspired by the really resilient, amazing, and just wonderful people that I met and spent time with in air raid shelters. It's very inspiring, and Ukraine should be very proud, very proud. Next slide, please. So the agenda, next slide. The things I'd like to talk to you about today are why Ukraine should think about certain kinds of changes, what those changes might be, but most importantly, why those changes haven't happened yet. And then I'd like to close with talking about how there are opportunities for change, particularly in the near future. Okay, so next slide. I work, as Petro mentioned, all over the world. I've had the opportunity to work with people and organizations and governments or governments in many parts of the world. And the change, the reason for change that we should want, that we should embrace, is to enhance general well-being. Now, we can argue about what well-being means. In Iran, for example, the ruling group of theocrats believes that well-being means complying with the rules of the Quran here on earth. But the most frequent kinds of ideations, of ideas about well-being, have to do with, kind of both material and individual well-being. That there's opportunities to, and there's opportunities to lead a safe life and a comfortable life. Next slide. So when we talk about that kind of well-being, opportunities to fulfill yourself, and enough material opportunities for a comfortable life, a life that's not desperate. Generally, what we're talking about is increasing the range of potential relationships. When we think about the kinds of things that were being contested in Ukraine in 2014 and 2012, 2016, they were generally about relationships, even though people might have thought of them in terms of, business or orientation. Like who could you form trade relationships with? Who was going to be the major investors into Ukraine? Who would be the major investors out of Ukraine? Who would have a say in governance, and how would they have a say in governance? All of those things are really just relationships. And so a lot of the contestation, not just in Ukraine, but around the world, has to do with the formation of relationships. And as a purely statistical and economic matter, the broader the potential range of relationships, the better off people are going to be. When we have a broad range of potential trade relationships, more input into what kinds of goods and services come into a country. It means that there's more input of goods and services that leave a country. And when there's more input, it means that the decisions more closely reflect the preferences of a broader range of people. When there is more potential for relationships regarding investment, same thing. It means that the investment decisions going out more closely reflect the preferences of a broader range of people. And, again, given how kind of amorphous the concept of general well-being is, when we reflect the preferences of a broader range of people, we get closer to whatever general well-being is in that particular place. And then, of course, governance. There's been a lot of research, mostly starting with Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen, but even before that, that shows that when more people have more of a say in governance, then the decisions more closely reflect not just the preferences of the broader range of people, but also the preferences of people who don't have as much of a say because of a lack of resources in things like trade or investment or markets in general. So by increasing the range of potential relationships, we're more likely to get to an increase in overall well-being. Now, if a polity decides that it's not interested in that kind of well-being, then they're not interested in increasing the range of potential relationships. So in places like North Korea, you're going to see a shrinking in the potential range of relationships. And without meaning to turn this conversation into a diatribe against Russia, one of the areas of real concern, even before the escalation of the war, was that the increasing authoritarianism of the government, particularly of Vladimir Putin, decreased the potential range of relationships. So we can see it expanding, general well-being, contracting. The polities or governments are making different choices, right? Next slide, please. So given that, I've been studying emerging economies for a long time now. We still don't know everything we should know, but I've been studying it for a long time. And given the focus on emerging economies over the last 20 years, our understanding of what needs to change, how has really, really grown. It's really increased. And back in the 90s, economists for the most part, but also lawyers and sociologists, focused on institutions. We've learned since the 1990s that there are at least two other factors that very much affect relationships. So what we know now is that institutions, appropriateness, and trust all affect our ability to form relationships, and all need to be changed a little bit, or if we want to expand the potential number of relationships. So institutions, appropriateness, and trust. Now I'll tell you that I tell my students in class, this is a growing field. We know so much more now than we did 30 years ago when I started studying it. And we'll know a lot more 30 years from now. So this isn't the final list, but it's the list that we know right now today. Next slide. So institutions are the scaffolding. They are what allows, the kind of like the infrastructure that allows us to form relationships. The technical definition of institution is a shared understanding of something like rules of how people interact. So the most famous institution, the institution that we all use constantly, is language. We share an understanding, and it's an understanding of a whole bunch of rules, and our shared understanding allows us to form relationships. If we don't share an understanding, right? I do not speak Hungarian. It's impossible for me to form a relationship using that particular institution, right? Now, what's interesting about institutions is that they can be available to a few people, or they can be available to a lot of people. And when an institution is only available to a few people, we say that it's relationally oriented. When it's available to a lot of people, we say it's formally oriented. And the movement that we want to see is from relationally oriented to formally oriented. So let us take Ukraine during the Soviet times. During the Soviet times, the nomenclatura had access to a lot of institutions that other people did not have access to, right? So those institutions would be considered relationally oriented. And only the nomenclatura could form relationships using those institutions. That meant there was a narrow range of people who could form relationships. And what we want is a change to broadening the number of people. And so after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of work in changing institutions so that other people could use them. So that it was not just the nomenclatura. It was almost anybody, right? Crony capitalism. Crony capitalism, which is a hallmark of oligarchies. Crony capitalism, there are institutions, but they tend to be networks that are limited to people who know each other, right? That's relationally oriented. It shrinks the number of potential relationships. When we move from crony capitalism to open markets, formally oriented, a broader range of potential relationships. Next slide, please. So when we think about the institutions in Ukraine, for example, that and you know, forgive me for being critical, but that you know, after independence or finding independence again in 1991, that you know, we're probably more relationally oriented and need to move toward formally oriented. They would probably include things like the law, courts, contracts, markets, banks, networks, governance. Ukraine has made amazing progress, and we'll talk about that later, toward formally oriented institutions. But you know as well as anybody some of the issues concerning some of these institutions. And these are all institutions that have a lot to do with business relationships in particular. Business relies heavily on law, on courts. Contract is one of the most important aspects of business. Markets, banks, networks, and governance, whether it's private governance of a firm, or governance of the marketplace, or governance of society in general. Next slide, please. Right. If more people have access to and use these institutions, then the probability, the likelihood of an increase in overall general, you know, well-being goes up, right? And so our goal, whether it's with Ukraine or with emerging economies in general, is to get more people to use these kinds of institutions. Okay. Next slide, please. When in the 1990s, when the combination of a number of things happened, including the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but also the democratization of Latin America, the end of apartheid in South Africa, the movement away from the neo-mercantilist governments in Southeast Asia, and the opening of markets in East Asia. All of those things happened. You know, people like myself went into these polities, into these places, and created fabulous institutions, and tried to get some kind of assurance from governance and from the legal systems that anybody could use them, and they didn't. And we couldn't figure out why. So we started studying, you know, other aspects, not just the structure, but how people feel about institutions. And it was discovered that appropriateness, and that's the term that's used in like literature in North America. Don't worry about the word. The concept's what's important. But that this appropriateness turns out is really, really important. People don't use institutions if they don't think it's okay. And they don't form relationships if they don't think that it's okay, right? So to use a very old example, in Russia, well, actually in Central Asia, which is where I spent most of my time, the term businessman was an insult. And it was not thought of as okay to form a relationship that had to do with private property, which is a relationship. It's a relationship between a person and a thing, or money, profit, right? And we spend a lot of time, the advisors and the governments in the region spend a lot of time trying to change the way people thought about these relationships and about these institutions. Right? So in Ukraine, well, we'll get to Ukraine in just a second. It's really important to understand that it's not just the institutions, it's also who you're forming a relationship and what kind of relationship you're forming. I lived in Mongolia for a year. I love Mongolia. And the Mongolians constantly asked, why don't people buy... Sorry, I'm laughing. I do love Ukraine more than... I love Ukraine. I love Mongolia very, very much. They asked, why don't people buy our electronics? And all I could tell them was, people don't think that's an okay kind of relationship, right? It has nothing to do with the quality of the electronics. It's how people think about the relationship. Next slide, please. So we want to move from, hesitation or, a mental, you just don't do this, or I've never thought about doing this before, so I'm really not certain about it, to it's okay. It's okay for everyone to use markets. It's okay to invest. It's okay to contract with people that you may never have contracted with before. It's okay for regular people to make decisions about all kinds of things. Next slide. Right. And this works in both directions. You may or may not, but you probably know of Ukraine's reputation for the last 20 years. And it's not, a reputation that's at the forefront of emerging economies. It is a reputation that, and we'll get to this later, but it's a reputation that isn't like, you got to go there, you got to form relationships with these people. Respectfully, and I'm only reporting, it's more along the lines of, well, you need to be careful. Well, the markets are really kind of funny. Well, there's a lot of, crony capitalism going on. Well, there's a great deal of uncertainty, etc. So when we talk about appropriateness, we're not just talking about changes in a place. We're also talking about changes about a place. Okay. Next slide, please. So we spent a lot of time working on how people thought about institutions and thought about relationships, and that led to some progress, but there was still a lot of it wasn't working the way that everyone thought it should be working. We built, they built these fabulous institutions, just really great looking institutions. A lot of arguments and a lot of thought, fabulous. And they spent a lot of time working on appropriateness, changing how people felt about institutions, changing how people felt about taking responsibility, making decisions, changing how people felt about relationships. Still wasn't there. And so finally, and this won't be the end because you guys are going to discover all kinds of things, but finally, in a whole separate branch of sociology, it turns out, another discovery was made, and this had to do with trust. So the kind of trust we're talking about here is something called generalized trust. Generalized trust is trust in the system, trust in behaviors. Everyone all over the world has heard about Scandinavia. You can leave your wallet. I've done this just as an experiment. Not my wallet, it was a fake wallet, but you can leave your wallet on a park bench and come back in an hour and your wallet will be there, right? That this is an incredibly trustworthy place. Institutions work, strangers behave the way we would like strangers to behave. And it turns out that generalized trust is just a critical ingredient in social and economic development. Just a critical ingredient. Next slide. Because generalized trust generates just an amazing economic and social benefits. Transactions are cheaper. It is so much cheaper to engage in a transaction when you don't have to build in all kinds of security in case the other side doesn't work, right? I used to love candy bars, Snickers bars in particular. In Central Asia, when I bought a Snickers bar, you have to walk past a guard, right? All the goods are behind plexiglass. You put the som down, the shopkeeper puts the candy bar down, you exchange at exactly the same time. That transaction just for a candy bar, right? Whereas in, Kyiv, you walk into a shop, pick up the candy bar, walk over to the cashier, right? You hand them any amount of currency, they give you the change. You trust that the stranger, the shopkeeper, is going to behave the way they should behave. That's a much cheaper transaction. Offloading costs. So in systems that have high levels of generalized trust, all of us offload costs onto the system because the system works. And because we've offloaded those costs, we can engage in a broader range of relationships, and we can engage in more relationships. And that generates all kinds of cool things for us and for the system. As one might imagine, in polities that have high levels of generalized trust, there are lots and lots more relationships than there are in polities with low levels of generalized trust. More cooperation, and cooperation leads to innovation. Studies done on Silicon Valley here in the United States. Let's try to replicate Silicon Valley. Let's create our own Silicon Valley. The people that go there to study what's going on in Silicon Valley come back and say, well, what's really happening in Silicon Valley is there's high levels of generalized trust. People trust each other, they trust the system, and so they cooperate. And that cooperation it creates all kinds of innovation that really wouldn't be possible without the high levels of generalized trust. So high levels of generalized trust aren't critical to what we're talking about. More people using institutions, more people forming relationships. As a bonus, it generates all kinds of other really interesting and important things as well. Okay. So why haven't these changes happened? Why is it that we can study what needs to be done? And again, I emphasize this is one choice that places make. Other places, like Russia, have decided to go in a different direction, right? But why is it that we can study this and say this is what needs to be done, and it still doesn't get done? That's a question that I ask my students all the time, and I ask them about particular countries. And there's some things that we know. First of all, there's a phenomenon called path dependency. The past deeply influences the present, right? Many studies have been done. You can tell people this will make you better off. They still won't do it because that's not what they've learned to do. That's not how they've learned to do things for generations. So 100 years ago, we used voting districts. 50 years ago, we used voting districts. That means almost certainly 10 years from now, we'll use voting districts, even though our understandings of democracy have changed profoundly in the last 100 years. And that's true of just about any institution that you can think of, right? Why do we do it this way? Turns out it's not because we're economically rational actors, that this is the optimal institution or set of institutions, and this is the optimal relationship or set of relationships. We do it this way because that's how we've learned to do it, and that's how we've always done it, right? Doug North, when he got his Nobel Prize, he talked about in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he talked about path dependency is, and how path dependency teaches us that a lot of economic theories based on independent, economically rational individuals really don't reflect the real world. Next slide, please. There's also a lot of psychology, a lot of the way that our brains work that affect why we don't make these changes. In particular, bounded rationality, right? We only know what we know, and we don't know everything. And so, a lot of the places where I have the really good fortune to work, to do things, they don't, understandably, they don't know all the different ways that things can be done, all the different kinds of relationships that can be formed. And that's particularly true when you're in a place that has a limited set of possible relationships. How can they know when they can't form relationships that would, expand the range of their knowledge about that particular thing? And there's also a lot of biases toward the past. Think in your own lives about the things that you revere, the things that you hold really important, the things that stir up your patriotism or stir up your feelings about home. Those are all things in the past. So there's a lot of biases towards the past, not just path dependency. That's a separate phenomenon. This has to do with how we think. We just tend to think of a lot of things in the past as, something that needs to be revered and preserved. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there's power. And I don't bring this up, and most people don't study this in the kind of Marxist sense. More in the sense of individuals rather than classes, right? And so people who have privilege tend to oppose change that will reduce their privilege. A lot of studies have been done on this in all kinds of places, including the United States. Even though the United States is not an emerging economy, people would rather that they didn't improve, that their lives improved less if that means they still have privilege over others, which is sad and bizarre, but it's just, the way people are built. There's also corruption, which is a really ugly manifestation of power. And corruption, unfortunately, is an obstacle to change in many, many, many countries around the world. Corruption is not just about preserving power. Corruption is a way of exercising power to enrich oneself at the cost of improvement or betterment of society in general, and the increase in overall well-being. And of course, corruption is a complex phenomenon that merits its own long talk. But right now, we'll just talk about it as an obstacle to the kinds of changes that we all know, that we've studied and know need to be made. As an aside, Ukraine has had a special problem with corruption in the past, and that's a problem that people from all over have studied and have commented on. Next slide, please. So, we know what kind of changes, generally need to be made. We need to move the way that institutions work from just working for some people to working for a lot of people. We need to change how people feel about relationships and institutions. We need to change generalized trust. And we know what gets in the way of making these changes. We know that there's path dependency. We know there's the way people think. We know there's power, and we know there's corruption. Well, what I want to talk about is opportunities for change. I want to make very clear, before I do that, I will be talking about the war. And I want to make clear that there's nothing good about this war. In the rest of my conversation, please do not think that I am saying, yay, there was a war. I'm not. And the rest of not the rest, most of the rest of the world wish that this war had never happened and deeply regret not doing more when Russia first invaded Ukraine many years ago. I'm not saying there's anything good about this war, but the war did happen, and it's about that in the context of moving forward. Okay, next slide, please. So path dependency, both economists and sociologists have studied this phenomenon now that we understand that it's not just an interesting thing, but it's a serious obstacle to progressive change. And what has been found is that, path dependency can be nudged. It can be, changed a little bit. But if there's a phenomenon, something happens that's called, in English, a schism, then path dependency can be broken. Right? So, for example, in Japan, after World War II, Japan became a democracy. And the way that the democracy was set up, by the governor of Japan, Douglas MacArthur, who modeled it essentially on U.S. democracy. But for all his faults, MacArthur was very careful to bring in Japanese influences. So it was a kind of a hybrid. And no matter what happened in Japan, they stuck with that mode until in the 1980s and 1990s, there was two earth-shattering corruption scandals. Changed the way Ukrainians thought of, I'm sorry, you're on my mind. The way Japanese thought of themselves and thought of their relationship to democracy. They were huge scandals, and that was a schism, and that led to Japan they rewrote the part of their constitution that had to do with democracy, and rethought about how that was going to work. So those those corruption scandals, one right after the other, constituted a schism. They broke path dependency. Next slide, please. Well, one of the paradigmatic schisms is war. War historically has acted as a schism. Keep in mind, the beginning of the story that I told was World War II. After World War II, Japan became a democracy, right? And so, again, there's nothing good about this war, but the war did happen. And this war could act as a schism, as an opportunity for Ukraine to think about things in a way that's not so dependent on the past, not so dependent on what has been done for hundreds of years. Not saying that the traditions and the things that make Ukraine special would go away. It's a schism in just the schism could be an opportunity for change in institutions and how institutions work, not Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian history and Ukrainian heritage, right? Next slide, please. Psychology. So the way that people think can be nudged, and there's even a book by Cass Sunstein called Nudge, right? But the way that we can really change how we think is through something called disruption. When an event happens that forces us to change our perspective, or to see things from a different perspective, or to take into account things that we've never taken into account before, or rarely taken into account before, that's disruptive. And it is with disruption that we find serious changes to appropriateness, right? So, for example, in Japan, again, the coincidence of the Meiji Restoration with Admiral Perry, forced Japanese, particularly Japanese nobility, but most importantly, Japanese merchants, to think about the world in ways they hadn't thought about it before. Japan before that was very closed off. And with thinking about this, with taking into account people they'd never thought about before or taken into account before, Japan changed from very closed off to a really large, very open, trade-oriented economy. All right, next slide, please. All right, and of course, war is historically very, very disruptive. It forces us we haven't thought about before, and about things we haven't thought about before. All right, next slide, please. This one is the most troubling and the most interesting at the same time. War, and you know, there are lots of people who study war and lots of people who study the effect of war on business. War tends to increase affinity and loyalty and cooperation. But at the same time, among some people, we see phenomenon like war profiteering. And after a war is over, there's usually a sense of exhaustion and a kind of a, I've sacrificed enough. Now it's time for me to look inward and think about myself and my family. Next slide. And so one of the really interesting questions is, which way will Ukraine go? And that's something there hasn't been a lot of study on. It's very difficult to look at empirical studies and say, we can predict that this country will do this or this country will do that. And so there's not a lot of knowledge out there that could tell us it's likely Ukraine will go this direction or that direction. But it is definitely something for Ukraine to be aware of. Next slide, please. So there's nothing good about this war. But since the war did happen, if we look at what needs to be changed, you know, in general, looking at emerging economies, why those changes don't happen, it turns out the Ukraine is actually in a position for positive change. There are many things that Ukraine should be hopeful about after this war. But critically, Ukraine should probably be thinking about these things now. Now, of course, winning the war is the most important thing to think about, but preparing for after the war is something that could start to happen now. Last slide, please. So, you know, glory to Ukraine. Again, the visit I had a month ago or so, and you know, the world is behind you. Most of the world is behind you. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that this audience might have. Again, thank you for being with me and us. And thank you to Ukrainian Catholic University and America House Lviv.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Nichols. It's really nice to hear this lecture. And for me personally, it's very powerful sentence. There's nothing good in this war, but as I understand, the war has consequences. For example, what I think now, your nation is consequence of this war for independence, actually, you know. And after the war, you created good nation, a lot of institutions and appropriateness and trust. So it's very, very interesting and I think powerful idea. So thank you for your support. And I want to ask a question. If I understand right, and for example, when you talk about trust, appropriateness, and institution, is it true that in the beginning, in the system, we should have trust in order at least to start to talk each other, to think, to rethink, to think what to change. So we will change the appropriateness actually if we have trust, and if we have appropriateness. So we understand what we have good and what we have bad, what we should change. So then we can build good institutions. Is this hypothesis right from your point of view, or?
Yeah,
Yes.
Petra, that's a really interesting question. So historically, there is no ordering. It doesn't necessarily go trust, then appropriateness, then institutions. It very much depends on why change is happening and what the place is like. So when Central Asia became independent in 1991, they were not expecting it. They didn't even welcome it to some in some places. And so, the people there and the people who came to help had to work with an environment where you kind of just had to build institutions and then work from there, right? But in Ukraine, as you point out, after the war is over, after Ukraine is victorious, there's the situation is going to be different. The world, I'm sorry, most of the world, and I recognize not all of the world, but most of the world will be, want to form relationships with Ukraine, will want to support Ukraine, will think of Ukraine as it's cool to form relationships with Ukraine. So there's going to be a real appetite for institutions there. On the other hand, inside of Ukraine, there, the spirit, the esprit, the sense of cooperation and accomplishment creates an opportunity for capitalizing on trust and to some extent appropriateness. And that may lead to an opportunity for consensual institution building. So you may have two tracks. You may have to immediately set up institutions for all these people outside Ukraine and set up a process for this inside Ukraine. But knowing that what you're trying to do and the three factors that affect it could really help you. Your question is a great question because it focuses on, it helps us focus on how do we get done what we need to get done. And it may be in Ukraine, you're going to have two tracks to do that. Mm-hmm. So it's not step one, step two, step three. It's look at what you've got and look at, the situation that you're in, and then try to get to that goal.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your answer. Here's a question. So it looks like you are optimistic about the future of Ukraine, but why are you optimistic? So
I am optimistic about the future of Ukraine. I'm optimistic because so I don't want to get into the minutia of who's going to win the war and how. I think Ukraine will win. So after that, my strong guess is that Ukraine will move in a direction that allows for the broadest range of relationships with the broadest range of people. I have a hard time believing that so many people in Ukraine will have made so many sacrifices and then let the government create a system that privileges one class of people and not everybody. And however that manifests itself, in key opportunities several times to walk through Maidan Square and through other parts of town, where with people who were at the protests, and this kind of mindset and these kind of people have had the opportunity to talk to a lot of local administrators that came in with Zelensky and their commitment to Ukraine. I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people outside of Ukraine who previously had not good attitudes about Ukraine. And again, I say that respectfully, but it is, it is what it is. Boy, everywhere I go in the world now, Ukrainian flags, people are wearing Ukrainian ribbons. Ukraine has a moment it can capitalize on where the world admires Ukraine and should admire Ukraine. And so, all of these things I think will push Ukraine in the direction of that the most people in Ukraine can have fulfilling lives rather than, you got to have connections, you got to know somebody, you got to have an in, which is kind of what Ukraine was like in the 90s and the 2000s. So that's why I'm optimistic. Again, truly want to emphasize there's nothing good about this war. And I'm not happy the war happened. But just looking at Ukraine's future, I think Ukraine has a lot of really good things going for it. So that's why I'm optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of winning the war, the Russian army is fighting for something they don't know and they don't understand, and unless they're getting paid by Warner to get out of prison, the Ukrainian people are fighting for their home, and they're going to win.
Thank you. Here's a question. So, do you follow what our government, local government, is doing for our present and future opportunities? So, you know what we do more or less now. What, in your opinion, is missing in this option? Any additional
Sure.
tips that you can advise do now? Because we understand that this opportunity for change, this window for changes, cannot be very narrow and exist not very long. So
Yeah.
what you will advise now? Thank you.
I think that that one thing Ukraine needs to think about, like now, is how to administer all the reconstruction money that's going to be flowing into Ukraine. When we look at what happened in Afghanistan, when we look at what happened in Iraq, the battles ended. Now, of course, in Afghanistan, the battle restarted later, but just for the moment, the battles ended, and then they thought about reconstruction, and they were both disasters. If Ukraine starts thinking about it now and talking openly and honestly with the likely aid donors, the reconstruction fund donors, I think you can build a program that not only reduces or eliminates corruption, but also creates a foundation for longer relationships and relationships in the private sector. So I would jump on that if I were Ukraine. And then the other thing that Ukraine might be thinking about now is I hate to say this, and I don't mean to stereotype Ukraine, but the creation of an independent anti-corruption body to deal with governance after the war is after the victory, after the war is over. Ukraine might also start thinking about having commercial law conferences or promoting relationships outside of Ukraine. But I think that could probably wait a little while. Those two things are things I would jump on right now if I were Ukraine, particularly reconstruction.
Thank you. And maybe, our time come to the end, but what cases will you can you advise us to follow in order to understand how to change trust, appropriateness, and institution in good way? So just give us some cases in order we can follow these cases and go inside. Can you?
Sure. So first of all, as you and I talked about earlier, there is no formula.
Mm-hmm.
It's not step 1, step 2, step 3. So you have to be really careful. But you can look at places like Uruguay. Uruguay is an incredibly successful model in Latin America, where other countries have had trouble. Costa Rica, incredibly successful in Central America, where other countries have had trouble. Panama, a very corrupt country that became very uncorrupt, again, in places where other countries have had trouble. So there are models out there. People will say, look at Chile. But Chile, they haven't had the kind of stability that Uruguay has had. Uruguay has been slow, but just very, very steady. And the people of Uruguay are very, very, very happy with what their government has done since the democratization in the 1990s. the early 1990s, which is 30 plus years.
Thank you for your time, dear participants. Thank you that you was with us this evening. Thank you, Professor Nichols, that you were with us this evening and for your wonderful lecture and answering question. Yes, thank you for your support, and I wish you good day, and I wish all people here in Ukraine good evening and peace time in our cities and villages. So thank you.
Thank you, Petro. And again, thank you to UCU and to America House Lviv. It is look forward to being in Ukraine again soon.